Thank you very much, Stuart, and good evening to everybody who's tuned in to our regular Monday night series of the Great Museums of the World. It's a great pleasure to be able to take you off, at least via the internet, to Venice for the hour that we'll have together. Please, if you've got any questions at the end of the session, feel free. I haven't got any dates out dancing later on, so I'm very happy to answer any questions. Well, as Stuart mentioned in his introduction, the Accademia in Venice is indeed a long-standing and important artistic institution in a city that is a major art city in and of itself. And so in my presentation tonight, I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'd like to be able to talk about the institution itself, the Accademia, the educational institution, which is the founding organization for the galleries that we see today, that the public can see today. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the actual site itself. It's got a very complicated history and a very long history. And one of the things that when you're going to see the Accademia galleries is that you actually see work from the original building, which the Accademia later occupies. So it's important to understand that. Moreover, it's not just one building, it's actually an amalgamation of three buildings, which makes it a rather complicated route through. So having covered both of those, of course, what I would like to do then in the last part of the talk is to highlight some of the collection. Now, there are so many works and so much to talk about, I've had to be rather selective. And so what I've chosen to concentrate on instead is some of the things that have been changed in the gallery recently, the way that some of the works from the Renaissance have been displayed, and then a new wing of the museum, which opened as recently as 2 weeks ago, which I don't think anyone listening tonight has had the opportunity to see. So even if you have seen the Accademia and visited the Accademia on numerous occasions, I'm really hoping there'll be something new for you as well in tonight's presentation. So I'm going to go now into slide share mode, and you should see, as well as the title of the lecture, the bottom half of one of the Accademia Gallery's most celebrated paintings. This is Giorgione, the early 16th century painting named La Tempesta, the storm. A little bit more about that. This is a celebrity painting in the sense that it's a painting that's famous for being famous. More has been written over 200 years about the interpretation of this work of art than perhaps any other painting in the canon of Western art. And it's just one of the many highlights for the gallery. But before we get into the history, I'm going to start off with something of a challenge or a conundrum. I mentioned in the introduction that Venice was a great art city. And rather than doing galleries, for more than 1,000 years, Venice did art. And so if you want to see art in Venice, you don't need to go to the Accademia. You can look just about on any corner. Here's just three highlights that I selected almost at random. In the bottom left, the almost 7,000 square meters of gold mosaics that adorn the interior of St. Mark's Basilica. You can see there some of those are dating from the 12th century going right up to the 19th century. Bottom right, one of the most famous equestrian statues of the Renaissance by Andrea Verrocchio, the Florentine, who was the teacher, of course, of Leonardo da Vinci, and that's depicting the Venetian mercenary warlord Bartolomeo Colleone, free for everyone to see outside the church of San Giovanni e Paolo, or inside the Doge's palace by the much-loved artist Carpaccio, his depiction of the Lion of St. Mark, which represents, of course, a lot more than just the evangelist St. Mark, also representing the city, republic, and empire of Venice. And uncharacteristically for a feline, but characteristically for Venice, this lion has got 2 feet in the water and 2 feet on the land. So with all of that wonderful art in situ able to be seen on just about every street corner, what on earth does an art gallery in Venice have to offer, or an Accademia? Well, as it turns out, don't turn off your sets right now, because my answer would be it has a lot to offer. For a start, it's the only place in the city where you get a comprehensive view of the story of Venetian art. And it is a very great story. It's a very long story, and it's a very important story in the history of European art. It also is, as we will see, a major teaching, or associated with a major teaching association, and it's also a place that continues to innovate. And as recently as 2 weeks ago, as I was just mentioning. So the Accademia, even though that this is an art-filled city, that was an art city before tourism invented the idea of the art city, the Accademia and its galleries still play an important role. Firstly, just locating the galleries, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but if you are, well, let's just enjoy this Google Earth image. And this is showing the sort of S-bend of the Grand Canal, with on the right-hand side, the so-called bacino, or the basin in front of the area of St. Mark's. I'll just put on my laser pointer so you can see, and then the Grand Canal coming up and turning this corner and then heading up towards the Rialto. And just at the beginning, you can see one of 3 bridges that crosses the Grand Canal. This is the 19th century bridge, which is called the Accademia Bridge because it lands on the Accademia galleries. And so you can just see 2 of the buildings there on the extreme right of the photo. And then when you get to the foot of the bridge, you discover 2 buildings, which, it has to be said, I'm sure you'd agree, these are not the most beautiful buildings in Venice. It's a city full of magnificent architectural examples. These 2 buildings are very messed around with Gothic church on the left and a rather out of place neoclassical 19th century facade on the right, with a strange, sort of difficult to explain doorway and building in the middle. Is not exactly a unified architectural marvel for us to enjoy. And it tells us something about the history of the building. Of course, that this is firstly not a purpose-built art gallery. This is not Frank Gehry or Frank Lloyd Wright designing an art gallery, or anything like Lorenzo Piano or anyone like that. This is a building that has been repurposed. And it tells us also that it's a building with a story to tell. And that's something that we'll look at in just a second. But firstly, let's look at the idea of an academia, or an institution, which is essentially in its origin an educational institution rather than an art gallery. Now, the idea of an art academia, a place where people could go and study the very best of painting, had been around since the middle of the 16th century. Indeed, it was in Florence under Cosimo de' Medici, the great duke, that the Accademia in Florence gets underway. This is followed about a decade later by Rome, which has an academy. Venice comes to the idea of the academy rather late in its history, perhaps because it was already a very active art city and didn't particularly see the need. Many other cities in Europe, such as St. Petersburg, Berlin, Copenhagen and Paris, had well-established art academies in the 17th century, a good 100 years before Venice gets its. But nevertheless, in 1750, the Senate votes, finally, you might think, to establish an Academy of Painting, Sculpture and Architecture in the city. The original location was a much more modest building than the current one, and you can see that building there in the top right of your slide. This was the little warehouse, or the Fondeghetto della Farina, which was a small building near St. Mark's, where flour for bread making could be distributed to the people. It was later taken over and repurposed, and it's the port captain's office today, and you can see that little building that's just there on the right. So the first departments in the Academia, when it opened in 1750, were figure drawing, or life drawing, if you think, portraits, landscape and sculpture. These were considered in the 18th century at that particular point the major sort of divisions of the arts, 3 of them painting and 1 of them architecture. And one of them and sculpture. Perspective and architecture are added a couple of decades later in 1768. A very important distinctive part of the Academia's existence gets going from 1777, where restoration of old paintings that were elsewhere in the city of Venice became a major activity of the Academia. And in fact, in 1819, a restoration department was established. There, and the restoration, of course, in Italy, the restoration of old paintings, Italy continues to lead the world in the science of restoration, and the Accademia in Venice, as we will see in my presentation, is one of the major institutions for that to take place. From 1798, we begin to see the accumulation of a collection which today becomes the galleries of the Accademia. And a small number of works start to be moved to the Accademia for teaching as examples of good art, things taken largely from sort of the more recent history of Venetian painting. Now, that date of 1798 is no accident. 1 year earlier, in 1797, Napoleon had threatened the city of Venice, and after a brief single exchange with one French boat, the Venetian Senate, the same Senate that established the Accademia, voted to extinguish the Republic and Empire of Venice. And so Venice in 1798, as a political entity, comes to an end. The French arrive shortly afterwards, and there's a huge amount of looting. Some of you may know of the works, things like the bronze horses and the lion in St. Mark's Square find their way off to Paris, but also a number of institutions around the city, including religious institutions, are closed down, and some of their paintings start coming to there. Well, Napoleon smartly hands over Venice to the Austrians, but then takes it back a few years later, returns to Venice in 1807, this time no longer as the younger revolutionary leader, but this time as the emperor. And the Accademia is reformed as the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. And the location is moved to its current location, which was a confraternity building, which I'm going to talk about in some detail, which, thanks to Napoleon, had been suppressed. So we have a desire with Napoleon for a larger Accademia, a larger institution, and we just happen to have a vacant building in the form of a very large and prestigious confraternity, which had been closed down by Napoleon, along with Masonic orders and many other things. Well, after Napoleon's demise, with the return of the Austro-Hungarians in 1817, the galleries are open to the public, and the Accademia galleries, as we know them today, are born. The close association with teaching, that this is a place of study, this is a place where you collect examples of the art of Venice from all periods, is still important. But in 1879, the teaching institution, the Accademia as a teaching institution, and the gallery that you visit was separated. The teaching institution, a very large and very important institution, is located on the Giudecca Canal in the building that you can see on the bottom right. And this is the former Hospital of the Incurables, which was designed by the great Renaissance architect Jacopo Sansovino. And the students, the young students who come there to study today, have got this glorious Renaissance cloister in which they can study. So very close, only a few hundred meters from the Accademia galleries, but formally separated from it. Well, in that early history, and it's not surprising, we find that many artists who've gone on to be greats in the history of Italian art are closely associated with the Accademia. We shouldn't be surprised about this, of course, because Venice is and was such a great art city. The first director of the Academy is an artist perhaps you might not have heard of, but a significant Venetian artist in the beginning of the 18th century, and this is Giambattista Piazzetta, and you can see there's a pencil self-portrait of him as a fairly young man up the top there. He's Venetian born, but did his training in Bologna, a little further to the south. Again, that tells you that Venetian art was in something of a bit of a decline in the late 17th, early 18th century. His artistic style, which you can see in the painting on the left here, is described as Rococo. That is a late Baroque style. He uses the intense contrast between light and dark, the chiaroscuro, that we see in Baroque painting, but it's not like a Caravaggio, for example. There's a much lighter, graceful charm to a work like the one on the left, which is called the Soothsayer or the Indovina, rather than the high drama of the Baroque. So there's the first work that you can hunt down in the galleries of the Accademia, is a work indeed by its first director. If we're to believe what we read about Giambattista Piazzetta, he was a fairly mild-mannered, unassuming kind of a chap, much less of a star, therefore, and much less in the public gaze than his contemporaries Giambattista Tiepolo or Sebastiano Ricci, who are generally acknowledged as the leading lights of Venetian painting in the early, in the 18th century. And indeed, Piazzetta spends the last 4 years of his life not painting sort of professionally, but teaching at the Accademia, which has been chosen to lead as the first director. Well, if Piazzetta is a fairly unassuming kind of person, the first president of the Accademia certainly wasn't, and that was the great 18th century artist, an absolute star of the Venetian art scene, and somebody who's often described as the greatest artist of all in 18th century Europe, and that's the Venetian Giambattista Tiepolo. And we're looking at one of his works, which is in the Accademia Gallery. I chose it specifically. It's a ceiling piece, The Exaltation of the True Cross. And indeed, this came to the Accademia in the late 19th century from Spain, from Madrid, because Tiepolo was such an international success that he'd spent important parts of his career overseas and actually dies in Madrid. Well, when the Accademia is born, Tiepolo himself is overseas on one of his commissions. He's in Würzburg in Germany. He's 6 years into a 10-year stint that he has decorating the Prince Archbishop of Würzburg residence. So magnificent hallway, this vast fresco by Tiepolo depicting the continents, the known world, as well as many other works in this 10-year project that is today a UNESCO World Heritage site. As I said, Tiepolo understood both how to please an audience and to create great art seemingly effortlessly, this idea of sprezzatura and unforced grace, as well as the magnificent Venetian light that people say bounced from the canals in his work. But he also knew about the business of art. And before leaving for Madrid, he gave us this quote about what he thought art should be. Painters should strive to succeed in creating great works, that is, those that can please noble lords and the rich, because these make the fortunes of masters, and not other people who cannot buy pictures of great value. So the painter's mind must always aim at the sublime, the heroic, and for perfection. And with those very lofty aims, the first president of the Accademia takes up his role. We have a couple of important fellows and students who we should also consider when we're thinking about the Accademia as an institution. One of them, and here's a painting, his only painting indeed, that you can see in the Accademia, is Antonio Canal, better known to us as Canaletto, in the English-speaking world, the absolute epitome of 18th century art in Venice, enormously popular with the grand tourists who came to the city. And thanks to his English agent, there are more works by Canaletto in the collections of the English royal family and the English aristocracy than certainly they are in Venice. He was a very, very well-established artist. By the time at the very end of his career, age 67, he decided that he wanted to become a fellow of the Accademia. And like any other artist, an apprentice artist or a master like Canaletto, he had to produce a work that showed him to be worthy of joining the Accademia. So rather than the topographical pieces for which he was so famous and so in demand, Canaletto, one would have to imagine rather begrudgingly, has to turn out this perspective, a genre piece, a sort of a piece of everyday life, in order to display the academic qualities of his work, the technique, the solid technique that underlay his art. This was important. This is an important criteria for a teaching institution which put such great store in drawing, for example. So this perspective, if one sees the openings to the upper level, or perhaps the shield that's hanging down there towards the people sitting in the loggia, that's oblique to us, the viewer, the great skill that's required to render those very accurately, not to mention, of course, the diminishing lines of the columns of the loggia or the staircase going up on the left. All of those works, of course, demonstrate Canaletto's supreme skill. We're hardly surprised by that, are we? And it meant that at age 67, he was invited to join the Accademia. He dies just 3 years later. A couple of important students of the institution now who really help to establish the very great reputation of this institution. One of them is the great neoclassical sculptor Antonio Canova, who studied very soon after, a couple of decades after the Accademia opens in the 1770s, and goes on to become the most famous neoclassical sculptor in Europe. So this style of classicism reborn, very fashionable in Paris and the German-speaking world. Caneva's fame spread throughout Europe. Indeed, this particular work, one of his most famous, Cupid and Psyche, many different versions of it, one going as far as Catherine the Great in St. Petersburg, in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. So with people like Canova, the reputation of the Accademia was certainly on its way. By the way, Canova, one of the important things he does early in his career, he's responsible for bringing back many of the works of art from which had been stolen by Napoleon from Venice when he arrived in 1797. It was Canova's job to assemble those and see their safe return. So the bronze horses, for example, are thanks to this proud student of the Accademia. Another artist from the middle of the 19th century, very famous particularly in Italian contexts, perhaps not so in the English-speaking world, is Francesco Hayez. He was born in Venice. His mother, in fact, came from the island of Murano. He studied at the Accademia from 1806 to 1810, winning a residency to further his work in Rome. His big break comes some decades later in 1850, when he is appointed the director of the famous Brera Gallery and also an Academy of Art in Milan. This is Milan's premier fine art institution, and under Hayez, the Brera really came of age in terms of its collection and the quality and the display. Well, in the Brera in Milan is the Venetian-born Hayez's most famous work, a romantic work, or work of the Romantic period, romantic in all the senses, of The Kiss from 1859, a much reproduced version. The latest version I saw of this had both the man and the woman in masks protecting themselves from COVID-19. So a little bit there about the actual institution of the Accademia. Let's turn now and have a look at the site itself. And as I mentioned at the beginning when I showed you the slide, there are actually two joined buildings. Now I'm starting with one of them, the Confraternity, because that is an important building, an important concept to understand, not just for the history of the building, but for the kind of art that you can see, and a very distinctive Venetian form of art that you can see several rooms of within the gallery today. So a confraternity is a lay order, a lay order dedicated to good works. So they're not monks, they're not priests. You don't go to their confraternity headquarters, such as the building that you can see here, to go to mass. But the members of the confraternity do good works. They might look after the poor. They will certainly provide a good funeral, a good send-off for their members. If there are orphans or widows from members, the male members of the confraternity, they will be looked after. They might be dedicated to looking after the sick. And so some of the first hospitals in Venice and other cities in Italy are created by these confraternities. In times of plague, and that came to Venice quite often, they had a very special role to play very often in helping to protect the citizens, both with health messages, but all not messages, but health measures, but also helping, of course, to bury the very large numbers of the dead. So the confraternity of Santa Maria della Carità, St. Mary of Charity, the one in which the Accademia is based, and you can see an 18th century painting by Canaletto with a detail of the way the facade looked before it became an art gallery. This was established in 1260, and it was quite likely the first of the formal confraternities, that is the first sort of permanently established confraternity in Venice. Certainly it was the first to gain the adjective grande, meaning that it wasn't a trade guild, which was also called a scuola, nor was it a confraternity which looked after a particular ethnic group like the Dalmatians or the Greeks, for example. Like the other scuole grande in Venice, and there were 6 of them, the origins, the historical origins of this confraternity were in the penitent or flagellant orders, the so-called battuti, or quite literally the beaten ones. These orders arise in the Middle Ages, in the 12th and the 13th century in particular. The men who were members of the order would pay public penance in order to expiate the sins of humanity, would walk through towns beating themselves shirtless, beating themselves with whips to show their piety. Well, yeah, this was a time when, the end of the world was regularly predicted because of man's iniquity and sinfulness. So eventually, I guess they get into more purposeful, charitable purposes when they arrive in Venice. And so this order starts off just simply renting rooms from the adjacent monastery, which actually is older, and I'll talk about that second. The monastery of the Carità, as it was named, is where the confraternity gets its name from. But like many of the other confraternities, the Scuola Grande della Carità became enormously popular and enormously wealthy, and we'll see that in just a second. By 1343, it established that building that you can see there now, a two-story structure. So the organization was wealthy enough to have a two-story building. That was further extended and greatly enhanced in the 1400s. Eventually, as I've already mentioned, the confraternity was suppressed by Napoleon. Now, one of the reasons that confraternities become such important art sites in Venice has to do with the social structure of Venice, and specifically that at the beginning of the 1300s, admission to the nobility of Venice was restricted. This was the so-called Golden Book of the nobility and the closing of the Golden Book, which meant that if you were to have a senior administrative role in the Republic, one of the senior political roles, or become Doge, your name had to be in the Golden Book. You had to be from an historically noble family. What that meant was that people continued to get wealthy in the city and have influence, but they couldn't become part of the nobility. They were in the middle classes. And so confraternities, and especially the Scuole Grandi, become places where the enriched or the wealthy middle class can express their social prestige through commissioning great works of art and having magnificent headquarters in the kind of network. So it's like a very wealthy version of a Rotary Club. And certainly the venerable Scuola Grande di Santa Maria della Carità, which becomes the Accademia, was one of those. Just on the bottom left there, you can see the original sign, which you'll see around the building, of the cross with the labyrinth through it. So dotted around the city of Venice are a number of confraternities, some of them Scuole Grandi, and some of them other kinds of confraternities. So the Carità, which I've named here on the site of the Accademia, is just one of them. You might be familiar with the confraternity of St. George of the Esclavonians, or the Dalmatians, famous, a beautiful small confraternity with paintings by Carpaccio, a beautiful site where you can see, or Tintoretto's famous works, 64 canvases, no fewer, 30 years work for Tintoretto, which he undertook at the Scuola di San Rocco. So some of these confraternities still exist as art sites within the cities. Others, such as San Giovanni Evangelista, St. John the Evangelist, and St. Ursula, which was where the Church of St. Giovanni e Paolo is located, both of those collections find their way today into the confraternity of the Carità. So when you look at these buildings, and this is important, you'll have exactly this experience when you walk into the Accademia, following the model of the Carità, which is the Accademia, the confraternity houses, or the clubhouse, if you like, were always on two levels. Now, this cutaway drawing is actually the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, but the design is identical to the Carità. I just had one here to show you. The lower level, which in Venetian is called the Androne, or the foyer, this is where the alms giving took place. So if you were a widow or an orphan and you required the assistance, you required a house or some grain or a loan or something like that, then you would go into this lower area, and this is where you were helped. Perhaps if you were sick here as well, there were medical services available. So if you're an alms seeker, that's where you went. One of the ironies today is you received charity there when you walked into the Scuola della Carità. Today, when you walk in there, this is where you go and you pay money to the ticket collectors. So it's sort of the reverse, and it's not a very warm welcome that you get there, I have to say, and cloak your bags and things like that. So that area. But when you go upstairs, you've got the chapter room, or the Sala Capitolare, as it's called, which were for the more senior members of the confraternity, those wealthy middle-class people who I've mentioned, who wanted to display their social status. And so, of course, these rooms were magnificently embellished. And if you've been to San Rocco, you've seen that. Further off, and you can see it in this cutaway just here on the right, for the very highest members, there were 500 or 600 members usually in a confraternity, one of the scuole grandi. There were 6 senior people, the board, if you like, of the confraternity, and they met in a room called the Sala dell'Albergo. And so just off the chapter room on the upper floor in San Rocco, you've got this. So you get exactly the same, an analogous structure at the Carità in Venice, and we'll have a look at that in a second. We've got a few little signs of the very early years of the Scuola Grande della Carità floating around the building. This particular inscription, which is quite well known to Venetian historians, is rather hard to access because it's not in a public area. There occasionally it's open and you get through it in the courtyard. And it's a very interesting reference. It goes back to the first plague of Venice in the year 1348. So the confraternity was less than 100 years old at this particular time. And it's an account, and the confraternity, we know, played a major role in looking after the sick in that plague. And so here we get an inscription full of typical medieval superstition about the bad augurs, the bad things that happened before the outbreak of the plague. So I'll just read to you that inscription. In the name of eternal God and the Blessed Virgin Mary, in the year 1347 of the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, on January 25, the feast of the conversion of St. Paul, around the hour of Vespers, there was a great earthquake in Venice and almost everywhere in the world. The tops of many bell towers, houses and chimneys and the church of San Basilio fell. It created such fear that almost everyone thought they were dying. The earth continued to shake for about 40 days. And after this, a great pestilence began, and goes on to account then for the plague, which killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population of Venice and would have kept the confraternity rather busy. Another little sign of the original purpose we can see in this sort of rather mysterious doorway. Before the 18th century facade gets put on, we have this original entrance to the confraternity buildings with these late 14th, early 15th century relief sculptures in the Gothic style around the building. But it's when you go into the building, when you've paid your money, and you go up to the first floor, that you get the full impact of the wealth of the Scuola Grande della Carità. And indeed, the first of the rooms displaying the collection of the Accademia is the old Sala Capitolare, or the chapter house, or the alms givers space of the confraternity. And we're seeing 2 substantial works of Venetian artisanship. One is the ceiling, which is a 15th century ceiling in the Gothic style. And then from about a century later, a beautiful inlaid marble floor. Both of those pieces of decoration attest to the enormous wealth of this confraternity. And it's a pity, of course, when people come to the galleries, of course, they want to see the paintings. And here you can see displayed in this first room, this is showing the Venetian primitives, if you like, the 13th particularly, and some 14th century and even early 15th century altarpieces, mainly, which have been taken from the religious orders and the confraternities, which were suppressed by Napoleon, and found their display here. So this is the first room in the historical sequence. But it's a pity that people go straight for the paintings, because if you had a pair of binoculars and looked up to the ceiling, you'd see a spectacular piece of either late Gothic or early Renaissance Venetian craftsmanship in the form of this carved wooden ceiling embellished with painted and carved panels. So here we see cherubims and seraphims and archangels carved in to the timber there, the faces looking down at you, and then panels, some of them painted like the prophet St. Abies, some of them in great 15th century wood carving. This is St. Matthew, the evangelist St. Matthew, writing his gospel, which we know is the word of God, because there's an angel leaning behind his throne, telling him what to write down. So we know it's the word of God. And then, of course, it wouldn't be Venice without St. Mark, here again, writing down his gospel and giving us the account with a distinctive Venetian chimney notice in the background there, and the lion, which is of course the symbol of St. Mark, but also of the city, sitting rather like a placid pussycat underneath the chair, waiting patiently for its dinner, perhaps, while St. Mark busily writes his account of the life of Jesus Christ. But just off the Sala Capitolare, that entrance, here in the Accademia, you have the chance to see two very important works of art in their original situation. And this is the Sala dell'Albergo, or the boardroom of the confraternity. And it's got two works of art nearly 100 years apart, on the left and then on the far wall, which we're going to look at. And again, a bit like people not looking up at the ceiling, unfortunately, this particular room is at the very end of the circuit when you've been through and you've looked at hundreds of other paintings. So people are usually fed up with art, or their capacity to look at more works of art is exhausted. And what's more, this room is a bit of a bottleneck, and so a little unpleasant if it's crowded and people scoot by and miss two really significant works of art. On the left wall, just as you're coming down the stairs there, you can see this magnificent altarpiece, devotional piece, very large scale, which was made for the board of the confraternity by the leading artists of the middle of 15th century Venice. And they came from a family. It was they were brothers-in-law, Antonio Vivarini, Alvise Vivarini, who wasn't, and their brother-in-law Giovanni Alemagna ran one of the most successful and important painting workshops, and we see their work around the city. This is a typical devotional piece referred to as a holy conversation, where we see the Virgin and Child, and they're surrounded by important saints in an idealized setting, which comprises firstly hortus conclusus, an enclosed or a cloister garden around the outside, and then this beautiful wall, the garden wall, and we can see the bits of the garden through the piercings in the wall, but this very, very ornate Gothic style throne at which the Virgin Mary sits in an equally ornate, with an equally ornate dress and crown and halo, which seem to match very closely the throne which she's sitting. Well, this style of painting clearly harks back to the International Gothic, and it tells us how conservative Venice was in terms of painting compared to other places in Italy. Venice had always been maintained its connection with the East, with Byzantium. It didn't hold at this point, especially in the mid-1400s, much by way in store or have much in common with ancient Rome and the traditions of ancient Rome. That was all to change a few years after this painting was made, when Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Turks. So it's a almost consciously old-fashioned style painting that the senior members of the confraternity commissioned for their boardroom. Well, from slightly later, from the 1530s, we've got another leading artist, Titian. And by this time, he's an international celebrity. He's made his name at the Friary Church in 1515, and now he's receiving commissions for all over Europe, including from Charles V, the great emperor of Spain. And so this means for the members of the confraternity to commission this painting from Titian is another line in the sand, another statement to the Venetian people about how powerful and prestige this confraternity is, because it can afford the services of Titian, one of the greatest and Venetian artist of the day. The subject of the painting is from an apocryphal gospel account, but a story which was popular in Renaissance art, and it shows the presentation of the Virgin Mary as a young child to the temple at Jerusalem. So you see the priests at the temple, and she's often depicted as on her own, with a sort of, a maturity belying her tender age, can go up and approach these sort of awesome men independently. She, of course, she's got beautiful Venetian gold hair. She's wearing a beautiful silk dress. Venice was a great center for silk production. And of course, she's got a halo. The background is anything but Jerusalem. We've got the neatly ordered Renaissance architecture, the idealized architecture of the High Renaissance, perhaps Venice or perhaps Imagined City. And then on the left of the background, we've got a landscape that doesn't look at all like Israel. It looks more like Pieve de Cadore, which was the home town of Titian before he became famous. Looking through there, you can see the doorway to the left leading through to that original room there that I showed you originally. Notice that this painting is painted specifically for this place. We've got the staircase going up to the temple, and Titian paints into that keystones around there, which lie above the actual door, which was an entrance down the stairs and out to the street for the members of the confraternity there. So a very great work of art there. As I showed you in that original slide, the glory, this room is looking particularly good now, thanks to a restoration in 2011 and 2012 by the Save Venice Foundation. And here is just one of the art restorers who will come from the Accademia in Venice, this famous school of art restoration, working, I think, on the blue dress of the Virgin as she goes up the stairs. Let's now look at the actual church building which adjoins the confraternity, because that confraternity building is, after all, only about 3 rooms in the entire complex. So you can see just very small at the top of the screen. I'm sorry, I couldn't get a larger image, but there's an axiomatic drawing of the entire complex seen from the air, where you've got the confraternity building there on the right, and then the church of the Carità, and then behind it, the very large convent, which housed the priests, which served in the church. So a stone church, we know from the Venetian records, was erected here in the 12th century on the site of a probably much older wooden church, something going back to the 8th or the 9th century, which makes it amongst the very oldest churches in Venice. Dorso Duro, across the Grand Canal from St. Mark's, although today it's very central, was a very remote location. Remember, there was no bridge across the Grand Canal until the 19th century. So an important parish church. It was named after Santa Maria della Carità, and it was entrusted, the running of the church was entrusted to an order of canons, the canons regular, who later merged with the Lateran order. It goes on, it's clearly a prominent church. We can see that because of the restoration that takes place in the 15th century, and that's undertaken by Bartolomeo Bon, who's the leading sculptor slash stonemason in Venice at the time, responsible for many important works in the middle of the 1400s. We also know that the redecoration of the church in the Gothic style, in the so-called Florid or Venetian Gothic style, was paid for by none other than the Pope, Eugenius IV, who was Venetian by birth. Further on, a century or so later, in the 16th century, the convent is renovated by no less an architect than Andrea Palladio, who goes on perhaps to be the greatest architect of the Italian Renaissance. Nevertheless, in spite of all of this history, thanks to reforms in the church in the middle of the 18th century, 1768, the Lateran canons are suppressed and are no longer running the church. Here is how the church and the confraternity appeared in the middle of the 18th century. This is a detail of a very beautiful topographical painting by Canaletto, which is in the National Gallery in London, called The Stonemason's Yard. I've cropped this so you can't actually see the stonemason's yard, which is below, but a very interesting and well-rendered detail across the Grand Canal when there's no bridge. Shows us the confraternity building and the church looking like it's seen better days. Of course, this is before it becomes an academy. When you're inside, though, and walking, and you walk when you are inside along the first floor, if you look through the curtains, which are fairly, they're translucent, so you can actually see through them. And if you look out into the courtyard, or if you're on the lower level, which you can now visit, you might catch a glimpse of this magnificent facade. And if you know anything about Renaissance architect and see those beautifully proportioned orders of where you've got the lovely Roman arch with 2 pilasters, and then looking vertically, you've got the Doric order at the bottom, the Ionic order, and then the Corinthian order with the acanthus leaves at the top. You realize that you're dealing with a very sophisticated kind of architecture. And so it's no surprise to find that this is the work of Andrea Palladio, modeled almost directly on the Colosseum in Rome, the superimposition of the classical orders, something he observed firsthand when he traveled to Rome in the 1540s to make architectural drawings. buildings. So very plainly done in buildings. So indeed, Palladio was responsible. He'd been working in the countryside in Vicenza. He was just being known in Venice. And this is among the very first of his commissions in Venice. He supplants the great state architect Jacopo Sansovino in about this decade. We have surviving to us Palladio's original drawings for the courtyards because Palladio himself published them in his 4 books of architecture. So the facade I was just showing you was in this great courtyard that you can see here. There were 2 other courtyards, a smaller one here, which is still existent, and a secondary courtyard, which is today enclosed and is the lift well between the lower and the first floors. You might use it, or if you go down to the toilets, indeed, they're on the ground floor there. In between those 2 courtyards was the refectory of the monastery, which is today used to display works from one of the confraternities. Just a couple of later architectural additions to the building, to the fabric of the building. I've mentioned the facade. I just note quickly that's a neoclassical style building, and it dates from the period where it's converted to an Academy of Fine Arts. So it's in the latest early 19th century style, the neoclassical style. Other modifications, extensive modifications, which might be less obvious to you because of the way that they're done, are undertaken in the mid-20th century by the famous architect Carlo Scarpa, born in Venice, but well known throughout Italy for his renovation of historical buildings, particularly turning them into public buildings such as museums. So very unobtrusively, Scarpa provides a very minimalist stair that gets you between the Sala Capitolare, the confraternity, and the rooms of the convent. He also provides mod cons such as heating and air conditioning, and all important, I think you'll agree for visiting a gallery, seating so that you can sit down and admire the works. You don't have to stand for your entire visit. So Carlo Scarpa, sort of the last of the great architectural hands. And here's a glorious example of Carlo Scarpa's work. So the old church that I mentioned, which is part of the site, has been sliced in 2 horizontally. And the downstairs area is now used for temporary exhibitions during the Biennale. The upstairs forms part of the circuit, and you can see that thanks to Scarpa, this area, the Gothic windows of the church and the 2 side chapels have been used most imaginatively to display Gothic style works and those early sculptures that are preserved in the Accademia's collection there. So a very glorious top half. Scarpa has even put in those 3 steps to get you up to the level. So the little reminder of the high altar originally at a church, even though this is all, of course, a suspended floor halfway up the level of the actual church. So those 3 buildings then, the confraternity, the convent, and the church, give us the structure and why the building is so higgledy-piggledy. So you enter, and then the confraternity is where you've got number 1 in that room there. You then go through to buildings of the paintings of the Italian Renaissance, all through these areas here before you get to the 16th and then on to the 18th century. The space of the church area is dedicated to Gothic works plus some Renaissance works. And here where you've got numbers 20 and 21, you've got works from other confraternities, the confraternity of St. Ursula and St. Giovanni Evangelista, that have been brought in to the gallery. And indeed, that's where I'd like to go now in terms of looking at some of the distinctive paintings of the collection of the Accademia. Now, the confraternities, I hope I've established to you, were a very distinctive social institution in Venice. Confraternities existed in other cities, of course, but in Venice, particularly the scuole grandi with this disenfranchised middle classes are particularly important. And so we have in one space of the Accademia, and you can see Carlo Scarpa's laying out there, one of the most important painting cycles that comes from the Scuola Grande di San Giovanni Evangelista. This confraternity, the confraternity building still exists. It's in the San Polo area, not very far from the Frari Church, but the paintings, the confraternity was suppressed. And the paintings were removed and taken here to the Accademia. The room that they were originally displayed in was obviously much larger than this room. That painting at the end there is some 4 meters across, but still one gets a sense of these grand narrative paintings and their role in Venetian society. And at the very least, they've been kept together as a group. This particular work, some of the works are by Gentile Bellini, as well as other artists, and they're the ones that we're going to look at. This very, very famous painting from 1496 shows a procession in St. Mark's, and the purpose of the painting is to show the members of the confraternity of San Giovanni Evangelista on their at their moment of glory. And so wearing the white robes in the front, holding the reliquary under a canopy there, are the members of the confraternity. In front of them, you've got other confraternities who have already taken part in the procession and are standing in the corner of the square. Behind the members of the confraternity, you've got the upper orders of the Venetian hierarchy, of the Venetian aristocracy. You can see by the robes, you've got senators, the procurators of St. Mark's, and of course, just there, the Doge, who is preceded, of course, by his 6 trumpeters. If you think about St. Mark's Square as being the central social point of social ritual in the city, if you think about the Basilica of St. Mark as actually being a reliquary in itself, because it holds the most famous relic, the body of St. Mark. And so you've got the state relic, and then you've got the relic of the confraternity, which is being held in the front of the painting, in the front of the picture space. Where this hung in the confraternity originally, the actual relic in the monstrance, in the thing that you can see in the front of the painting, that was actually sitting there. So you had a relic in front of a painting of that relic, in front of a painting of Venice's most important reliquary. So the kind of divine connection between St. Mark and the members of the confraternity is there. But the story is clearly told in this painting as well, and it's shown by the figure kneeling here on the right. This relic that the members of the confraternity possessed was a fragment of the true cross. Now, according to legend, the true cross had been found in the 4th century by Constantine's mother, the Emperor Constantine's mother, when she was on a pilgrimage, and then during the Crusades, being brought back in fragments to Europe. There were 6 pieces of the true cross in Venice, but only one of them, the piece that was held by this confraternity, was deemed to be miraculous. And we've got proof or a reminder of that miraculousness here. The figure kneeling just to the right is a merchant from Brescia. His name is Jacopo de Salis. He had come some 50 years before this painting was made, in the 1440s. He had come to Venice on business, but he'd also come for another purpose. His son had been injured in a horse riding accident, and he came to the confraternity and the relic and prayed to them. Lo and behold, when he returned to Brescia, his son was getting better. And so this is 50 years after the event. This must have been significant. This was demonstration that the members of the confraternity possessed the one truly miraculous relic of the true cross. Well, the narrative cycle has another painting, and this was the one that was used in the introduction. This is a story that might put a smile to your face. The same confraternity, during one of the processions when the reliquary was brought out of the confraternity house and taken down, possibly for the procession in St. Mark's Square, well, on one occasion, that famous relic, the piece of the true cross, the miraculous piece of the true cross, falls into a canal. No doubt this was something that all of the chattering classes of Venice could well remember, and in a stupendous act of propaganda or reverse publicity or PR disaster management, Gentile Bellini turns this embarrassment into a virtue by displaying even further the miraculous properties of the true cross. So after the relic is dropped into the canal, the senior members of the confraternity, the brothers of the bench, who you can see there in white, all jump into the canal. But it's only to Andrea Vendramin, who is the chief, the guardian, the grand guardian, the head of the confraternity, the relic floats directly towards him as if by the will of God. It's the idea of the translational, the moving of relics by the hand of God. So thus, in this miracle of the relic floating towards Andrea Vendramin, the miraculous nature of the true cross is further confirmed. A second major cycle, which one can enjoy in the former refectory of it, is the story of the martyr St. Ursula. And this was from a confraternity who were dedicated, whose patron saint was St. Ursula, who comes from Cologne in Germany. And according to the Golden Legend, the medieval legend, she travels to Rome to meet the Pope with 10 virgins. Along the way, by way of legend, those 10 virgins become 10,000 virgins. They travel through Brittany and other places. When they come to Rome, or just before Rome, they are slaughtered by Attila the Hun. I'm not going to go through all of the detail of that narrative. We'll be here till 11 o'clock tonight. What I do want to show you, this superb cycle of works by Carpaccio, Vittore Carpaccio, the great artist from the early 1500s, is a wonderful display of Venetian fashion and shipping of the times. So this is the very large and gory painting of the massacre. And so here you can see the Pope copying it through the neck. St. Ursula's about to get it as well from this beautifully dressed Hun, one has to say, with the magnificent aristocratic sheath for his or quiver for his arrows. The latest, his physique shown off beautifully in the red tights and a wonderful blue and white silk doublet and very graceful gloves as he is about to give it to St. Ursula through the chest with his arrow. So yes, in the midst of the beheadings and the blood flow, there's very high fashion. Elsewhere, in the other less serious works, there's an absolute display. Now remember that Venice was a wealthy commercial city. It had visitors from all around the world. It was a great center of silk production, had been so for several hundreds of years. So it had people with the means and the motive to display the very latest. And so we've got this almost unreal world of Venetian fashion that's created by Carpaccio in this work. I mean, he's an absolute master of the detail. John Ruskin said that you have to look very, very hard sometimes to see actually what the subject matter of these paintings is. Here, this wonderful, we even have ordinary people such as this woman who is looking from a set of steps on at the massacre as it's happening in this. Well, if it's not people in high fashion, the other thing that Carpaccio gives us is ships. And we get a wonderful depiction of Venetian shipping as it looked at the beginning of the 16th century. So here is a trireme galley, the groups of 3 oars, and it's got a lantine sail. And it's one of the military escort ships that would have traveled with the larger boat behind it, part of the Venetian shipping convoys that you'll see. You also get little details of everyday life in a waterborne city, such as tender boats for embarking and disembarking from larger ships that's there. We get the maintenance of ships, such as the careening, the cleaning of hulls, which could take place in shallow waters by with towers and leaning the mast of the ship over. This happened in Venetian ports up and down the Adriatic and the Mediterranean. And finally, of course, it wouldn't be a Venetian painting by Carpaccio without at least one representation of a gondola and some of the lagoon scenery of Venice there in the background. Well, in the last section of my talk, I'd like to concentrate your attention on a few parts of the gallery which are quite newly done, which you may not have seen before. About 5 or 6 years ago, the High Renaissance section of the gallery was rearranged rather beautifully and with a very good didactic outcome. So here we see, for example, on one wall, 4 devotional pieces by the great artist, the great Renaissance artist, Giovanni Bellini, and that spans a significant period, 1465 to 1500, some 35 years. There was a revolution that was underway in Venetian art at that time, an art technique, and that's to do with the development of oil painting. So as had other Italians traditionally worked with a medium or a mix of egg tempera, which was used for panel paintings and also for frescoes. So with panel paintings, there was an intonaco, a plaster level, and then the paint was applied to it. Thanks perhaps to a visit by Antonello de Messina, an artist from Messina who had been up to Flanders, Venetians became aware of a new technique, which had been experimented with for some 40 or 50 years in places like Bruges and Antwerp, which involved using oil, linseed oil, as a medium rather than tempera. And during the course of Giovanni Bellini's career, he experiments increasingly with these. So we start with a work on the left, that's tempera. And if you look at the colors, and perhaps you can't see it, you might actually need to go to the Accademia to have a look. You'll see that it's quite a lot flatter, a little bit more lifeless, and a little bit more sort of traditional than the later oil paintings. The middle two are then a mixture with some layers in tempera and some in oil. And then finally, the work on the right is 100% oil, which allowed for many things, such as the mixing of colors on the palette and the application of glazes, successive thin glazes, to give all sorts of effects to it. Those four works then are complemented just on the right by this magnificent late work by Bellini, 1505, right at the end of his long life and his long career. It's called the Martinengo Pietà, named after one of the owners. And what I want you to be able to see on that is how, through oil painting, Bellini realizes that the very hard, crisp lines which had characterized both Flemish painting and the early Renaissance style, the Quattrocento style of fresco painting in Florence, was able to be softened, and we could begin depicting things perhaps the way that our eyes see them, which is not always as a crisp line. We could use very fine brushes to apply things like hairs, almost one hair at a time, and get these very fine effects. We could get tremendously subtle shading around the eyes and the face and things like that. So we get a style which is less dependent on the line and more dependent on color and shade. And we're getting towards something which eventually is going to get names like Impressionism and things like that in its more extreme forms. So it's this big shift away in art from those sort of hard Quattrocento styles that Venetian art is particularly famous for, and artists such as Bellini, but most importantly, of course, Titian, whose work we looked at, and his international career. One more artist, very quickly to show you beautifully on display, is Giorgione, a great artist, a much loved artist, apart from the one in the middle, the Tempest that I mentioned. There are only 37 authenticated Giorgiones in existence, and 3 of them are on display in the Accademia. They're all easel paintings, and they were owned by one collector. They're in the catalogue of one Venetian nobleman, that name we've seen already, Gabriele Vendramin, and they're catalogued in his collection. We have works like this one, only recently put on display. Nobody really knows the subject, but what I want to show you is just very quickly those gorgeous sleeves that you can see there, and how that sort of technique and the capacity of oil painting is really beginning to be exploited by Giorgione. His pupil, of course, is Titian. Giorgione's Tempest, I won't add to the many, many hundreds of thousands or millions of words, simply to say that sometimes people say that it's the atmosphere of this, that this is Europe's first landscape painting that's there. But the one I really love from this trio is this Vanitas piece. It's an old lady staring unblinkingly at us, the viewer, and in her hand is an inscription, a piece of paper that's got the words "Col tempo," with time. You too soon will look like me, or worse. So wonderful, searing psychological insight in this painting of Giorgione. This, rather than the other two, is the one that really speaks to me. Finally, and I apologize that I've gone a couple of minutes over time. I hope you can bear with me while I do that. I just want to give you the latest news, as it were, which is a reopening or an opening of a new wing downstairs, formerly in sort of storerooms and unused spaces of the Accademia, which is given over to 17th and 18th century art. Now, the Accademia was always a bit short in this area because in the 19th century, under the Austro-Hungarians and the French, when the Gallery was created, the view that was promulgated was that 18th century Venice, the last century of the empire, was a time of decline and of sort of corruption of the higher values of earlier periods, and that was reflected in sort of criticism of the art. Well, that's very much been redressed a couple of weeks ago with these new spaces where we've got 63 works of art never before shown. One of them is spectacular. It's the one at the top, which is the episode of the brazen serpent, or Moses holding up a brass serpent and protecting the Israelites from an invasion of them. This work, which was originally hung below the nuns' enclosure in the Church of St. Cosmas and Damian, the high cage through which the nuns watched the Mass. This is 13.5 meters long and 1.6 meters high. It was done in 1732 when Tiepolo was at the beginning of his career. Later on, he became very famous. He wouldn't have needed commissions such as this. And so here's the work just a month or so ago being positioned in the lower floors there. So that's something that you can enjoy on your next visit to Venice. I'm certainly looking forward to it. But one artist in this collection who I'm really excited to see is Giulia Lama, who lived from 1681 to 1747 and was a childhood friend of the first director of the Gallerie, Giambattista Piazzetta. She is a Rococo artist as well, but she's got a much darker, tense style. She's famous in art history as perhaps being the first woman to study a male nude life drawing, and such is the lot of female artists and talented female artists. Of course, in the course of history, many works by her were attributed to other male artists, and it's only in the last 10 or 15 years that we've had more works attributed to her. This is a portrait of her, by the way, by her childhood friend and the first director of the Accademia, Giambattista Piazzetta. But this is the painting that you'll see, and it's the episode from the Old Testament of Judith and Holofernes. So Judith, who is about to slay the Assyrian general Holofernes. Unlike so many other representations of this episode from Donatello onwards, the focus is not on the violence of the killing, but it is showing Judith in a moment of contemplation, and one would think divine contemplation, before she commits the act with a servant, an older servant looking on from the bottom right. But it's the wonderful drawing of the male nude that we see here is the really striking thing in this painting, which is being displayed now for the first time in the Accademia. I mentioned that Giulia Lama is thought to be the first woman, thanks to Venice's liberality and thanks to the institutions like the Accademia. She's able to study nude figure drawing, and she has this remarkable composition. We also know there's been found a trove of some 200 pencil drawings of hers, which are studies of male nudes. So this superbly realized figure in this painting is a great example of her art. And just to compare it, to see how different it is, there's another famous rendering of the story of Judith and Holofernes by another important female artist, Artemisia Gentileschi. So I'm hoping that the addition of this painting by Giulia Lama makes up for the very disappointingly small collection of another great female artist, Venetian artist, Rosalba Carriera, whose pastels, whose ability to create portraits in pastels made her famous throughout Europe. She had periods in Paris, Dresden, and elsewhere. The Accademia has just 2 paintings by hers in the collection, including the one that you can see here on the left, a self-portrait of herself as Winter from 1743. And then lastly, just to show you that the Accademia is not all about old art, in the lower areas, we've got these 2. This is the lower floor of the church that I showed you before. We've got these large exhibition spaces, which are often used during events like the Biennale to foreground contemporary art. So this is the American artist, Philip Guston, from the 2017 Biennale. I was lucky enough to see this show, a major retrospective of his work called Philip Guston and the Poets. And just announced for the Biennale next year is an artist you're probably familiar with, the contemporary English artist Anish Kapoor. And so the exhibition space will be handed over to him. So look, I apologize. I have gone about 10 minutes over time, 9 minutes over time, but I hope that's given you an introduction to the Accademia as an institution, the history of the building and the confraternity, and some insight into some of the magnificent works within its walls. Thank you very much.